Okay, so welcome everyone to another session of the Leuven seminar. Today we are very pleased to welcome Nataliya Palatnik, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. She works on Kant's practical philosophy, and she has several publications on the topic, of which I would like to mention the following articles. So she has just she has a paper that has been accepted in the Journal of the History of Philosophy and is forthcoming on Kant's practical ideal of perfect virtue. Then I would like to mention a 2022 paper titled Towards the Highest Good, Endless Progress and Its Totality in Kant's Moral Argument for the Postulate of Immortality, published in the Journal of Transcendental Philosophy. And also another 2022 article titled Kantian Freedom at a Distance, published in the British Journal for the History of Philosophy. Nataliya Palatnik will give a talk today on moral sensibility and moral self-constraint in Kant's practical philosophy. And as a respondent to her paper, we will have Maria Borges. She's Associate Professor at the Federal University of Santa Catarina in Brazil. And she works on Kant and Hegel, particularly on the topics of morality, emotions, and anthropology. She also has several publications, and I want to single out two publications in English. So a publication titled "What Can Kant Teach Us About Emotions?" Published in the Journal of Philosophy in 2004. And also the article Physiology and the Controlling of Affects in Kant's Philosophy, published in the Kantian Review in 2008. Nataliya will present her paper she will talk for about 40 minutes. And Maria Borges will respond to the paper in 10 minutes. Then Nataliya will have the opportunity to reply to the response. A very short reply of 5 minutes, and then we'll have 30 minutes for a general Q&A. And after the formal part of this talk, we will leave the meeting open for informal conversations, and you are all very welcome to stay connected. And I just would like to mention that if you could, if it's possible for you to switch on your cameras, it would be great so that we can emulate the ambience of a seminar in person. And without further ado, I will hand the floor to Nataliya Palatnik. Thank you so much for being here today, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Luis. And again, I want to thank Karen and the whole organizing team for inviting me to give this talk. And also a special thank you to Maria for agreeing to read my paper and give comments. And I look forward to learning from your thoughts about the paper. Something happened here. All right, I'm going to share the screen. I put a handout in the chat, but I'm also going to share the screen with the handout. It's all visible, good? Good size to read?
Yes, it's good.
Okay, so basically, as I read, I'll refer to certain passages mostly that I'm quoting from Kant, and they're numbered K1 through K12, and then another one from Barbara Herman, H1. So I'll be referring to this handout a little bit, but I will not sort of refer to every line of it. So hopefully that will work. well. So anyway, here we go. So in the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant makes an important claim. That's K1. Any consciousness of obligation depends upon moral feeling to make us aware of the constraint present in the thought of duty. I will call this moral feeling dependence thesis. It seems surprising, however, that we need moral feeling to become aware of necessitation present even in a thought of duty, given Kant's claim that moral agents have an a priori appreciation of the authority of the moral law. Moreover, on the face of it, the moral feeling dependence thesis sits uneasily with Kant's description of moral feeling as practical, as a feeling that arises from our consciousness of moral constraint and is the effect of this consciousness. So in the critique of practical reason, for example, and that's K2 on the handout, he describes duty as an action which, quote, contains in its concept practical necessitation, and adds, quote, that the feeling that arises from consciousness of this necessitation, contained in the concept of duty, is practical only, that is, possible through a preceding objective determination of the will and causality of reason. I will refer to the question of how moral feeling can both arise from our consciousness of necessitation of the will by the moral law and make us aware of this necessitation as a necessitation awareness puzzle. That's also on the handout on the screen. Much is at stake in making sense of the moral feeling dependence thesis. The idea that the constraint present in the thought of duty is moral self-constraint, that we are bound by requirements of our own reason, is the fundamental commitment of Kant's moral theory, of course. And if, as Kant claims, our consciousness of moral self-constraint depends on moral feeling, then in making us aware of the constraining relation, our moral sensibility must also contribute to our conception of the relata it connects, of ourselves as at the same time binding and as bound. Hence, the thesis suggests that moral feeling plays an indispensable epistemic role in our moral consciousness and self-understanding. But here's some questions. What exactly is this epistemic role? How does moral feeling contribute to our consciousness of obligation as moral self-constraint? And what can it tell us about ourselves as subjects of duty? My aim here is to answer these questions. Doing so, I think, will both show us why moral feeling is indeed essential to our moral self-consciousness and shed new light on Kant's moral feeling dependence thesis. In particular, I will argue that moral feeling enables an agent to regard himself as the addressee of the categorical imperative, and hence makes possible the awareness of the, quote, constraint present in the thought of duty, unquote, as moral self-constraint. I will approach this somewhat indirectly by sketching a notable difficulty with Kant's double self account of moral self-constraint. An agent's consciousness of being bound by the moral law, according to Kant, is her consciousness of the relation in which her pure rational self, or homo noumenon, normatively constrains her choices as a natural human being, or homo phenomenon. Yet it is unclear how a subject, conceived merely as a phenomenal being, a part of the world of sense, and subject to its causality, could be regarded as normatively constrained at all. So Henry Allison brings this up as an issue, a question for Kant. So the challenge lies in explaining how the agent can think of himself as the addressee of the categorical imperative, as someone who is bound by the moral law, right, the proper subject of the moral law. Taking Kant's moral feeling dependence thesis as a clue to meeting this challenge, I will consider first what moral feeling is and offer an account of the sources and constitution of its phenomenological complexity as both negatively and positively balanced. this complex normative feeling, and its normative character, and its meaning for the moral agent. I will then argue that reflection on moral feeling, so constituted, allows the agent to think of himself as a sensible being of a special kind, as someone who has the capacity for being affected and moved by moral considerations, as a sensible being who is, as the quoted passage at the top of the handout has it, not so completely an animal as to be indifferent to all that reason says on its own. It is because moral feeling makes possible and gives rise to this moralized conception of the sensible self that an agent can coherently think of oneself as bound by the law of her own reason, as the addressee of the categorical imperative who is capable of becoming a good-willed human being through moral progress. Moreover, on the account I offer, we will have a way of dealing with the necessitation awareness puzzle. I hope to show that there is a non-paradoxical sense in which moral feeling both arises from our consciousness of moral constraint and makes us aware of this constraint. I'll say more about this, obviously, as the paper goes on. So I start with Kant's conception of moral self-constraint in terms of phenomenal noumenal distinction. So for Kant, we become immediately conscious of the authority of pure practical reason and its fundamental law as soon as we engage in practical deliberation or face morally relevant choices. Making sense of being constrained by our own pure practical reason requires a particular kind of self-conception. Indeed, on Kant's double self or dual personality theory of agency, an agent represents being bound by the moral law as a relation in which her pure rational self, herself as a free intelligence, a homo noumenon, normatively constrains her choices as a thinking being belonging to the order of nature. So herself as a homo phenomenon, a natural being with reason. This practical version of Kant's phenomenal noumenal distinction plays a key role in his account of the bindingness of the categorical imperative and the possibility of moral obligation. So, for example, in preparing the way for the deduction of the categorical imperative in groundwork 3, he argues that an agent who stands under the categorical imperative and sees himself as under duty thinks of himself as belonging both to the world of sense and to the world of the understanding. K3 quotation on the handout. So he says, when we think of ourselves as free, we transfer ourselves into the world of the understanding as members of it and cognize autonomy of the will along with its consequence, free morality. But if we think of ourselves as under obligation, we regard ourselves as belonging to the world of sense and yet at the same time to the world of the understanding. Now, since this is a practical conception of oneself as an agent, it cannot involve an observational or predictive conception of the sensible self as merely an object affected through the senses. She cannot be conceived or conceive of herself merely as, quote, part of the world of sense, whose desires and inclinations operate as causal determinants of her behavior. But makes no sense to talk about morally binding a human being regarded merely as such, as subject to the deterministic natural laws. And again, Henry Allison makes the same point in his commentary. Rather, qua addressee of the categorical imperative, the subject of obligation must be regarded as capable of recognizing and being responsive to moral considerations, even when they conflict with her sensible desires and inclinations, as she must be regarded as someone whose sensible nature is amenable to moral demands. Unfortunately, Kant offers no direct discussion of the nature of this agential conception of oneself as a phenomenal being or its sources. This makes it much more difficult to make sense of his double self-based account of the bindingness of the categorical imperative. But we can better understand the nature of the complex practical self-awareness involved in our consciousness of obligation and make sense of Kant's claim that our sensible self can be normatively constrained by taking a cue from the moral feeling dependence thesis. This thesis suggests that to find the relevant answers, we must look to Kant's theory of moral sensibility and consider in particular the nature of moral feeling and its role in our moral self-awareness. So here's my claim. It is reflection on moral feeling, as I will argue, that allows us to think of ourselves as responsive to moral reasons and hence as an addressee or proper subject of the categorical imperative, someone who can be bound by moral requirements. And if all goes well, this should provide us with new insight into the nature of dependence of consciousness of obligation on moral feeling that Kant affirms, and his thesis, help untangle his necessitation awareness puzzle, or what I called necessitation awareness puzzle. All right, so now I'm on to section 3. So what is a feeling of respect for the law, and how can a moral feeling, and how can we be, we have such a moral feeling? So Kant introduces the idea of moral feeling as the feeling of respect for the moral law in Groundwork 1, where he describes the feeling, and this is, I'm going to just read the quotes for the groundwork, and that's K4, but there are also similar characterizations of moral feeling in the Critique of Practical Reason and the Metaphysics of Morals, and that's respectively K5 and K6 on the handout, but I'll skip them to save time. So in the groundwork, he describes it as a feeling that is, quote, self-wrought by means of a rational concept, unquote, which makes it specifically different from all feelings that are merely received through the influence of external sources. An agent feels respect for the moral law when, in deciding how to act, she recognizes that she is facing a morally relevant choice, whether she decides to act as morality requires in the end or not. This feeling is self-wrought because the source of this feeling lies in the activity of her own pure reason, making categorical demands on her choice. It is the way she experiences this activity. So Kant describes the feeling of respect in this context as also immediate determination of the will by means of the law and consciousness of this. Respect for the law, Kant stresses, must be regarded as the effect of pure practical reason on the subject's sensibility, quote, not as the cause of the law. He proceeds to characterize this feeling in distinctively normative terms as, quote, consciousness of the subordination of my will to a law without the mediation of other influences on my sense, and as a, quote, properly the representation of a worth that infringes upon my self-love. And as I mentioned, we find parallel descriptions in the Critique of Practical Reason and in the Metaphysics of Morals, which, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip. There is much to puzzle about in Kant's characterizations of moral feeling. But the question I want to focus on here is, how is such a complex and normatively structured feeling possible? And to address this question, I'd like us to consider Kant's most extended treatment of moral feeling, which occurs in the 3rd chapter of the Critique of Practical Reason, on the incentives of pure practical reason. Briefly, in that chapter, Kant argues that our recognition of the moral law as the objective determining ground of the will, or put more simply, recognition of how we morally ought to act, has a necessary negative effect on the lower faculty of desire. It painfully restricts our sensible inclinations, and we can know that consciousness of the moral law will have this effect on us a priori, simply in virtue of our awareness of the categorical form of moral demands. For coming to see that fulfillment of our sensible impulses and inclinations is limited by unconditional moral requirements, is inherently displeasing. As Kant puts it, in the moral law the moral law by thwarting all inclinations must produce a feeling which can be called pain. So it's inherently painful. In thwarting inclinations, the moral law places limits on the activity of empirical practical reason, our tendency to use reason in the service of self-love. Kant initially describes self-love as, quote, a predominant benevolence towards oneself. But he quickly turns to normative language again, characterizing it as a propensity of the sensible self to make claims on our will on behalf of our desires and inclinations, treating these claims as fully justifiable. Our nature is so constituted, he tells us, that, and this is case 7, so our nature is so constituted that we find our pathologically determinable self, even though it is quite unfit to give a universal law through its maxims, nevertheless striving antecedently to make its claims primary and originally valid, just as if it constituted our entire self. In other words, self-love is the disposition to judge satisfaction of desires and inclinations that belong to us as sensible beings as just as such objectively good reasons for action. While self-love can become reasonable, according to Kant, when our pure practical reason succeeds in limiting its activity to the condition of agreement with the moral law, it transforms into self-conceit, another key concept in Kant's theory of moral sensibility, when we take its demands to be unconditional practical principles. So this pernicious kind of self-regard, and it is a kind of self-regard or self-esteem, is the propensity to arrogant self-satisfaction, the propensity to claim for ourselves esteem that is independent of morality or prior to morality, that manifests in regarding satisfaction of our self-interest, a fulfillment of sort of our striving for happiness as the highest and unconditional value. In self-conceit, we judge demands of our self-love above all else and as law-giving for everyone else. We treat it as the sole source of genuine, objectively good reasons, in other words. Now, consciousness of the categorical character of the moral law, Kant argues, must result in a painful limiting of the activities of self-love and in weakening and, in fact, quote, striking down self-conceit by exposing the pathologically determinable self's claim to dignity as groundless. This way, he writes, the moral law deprives self-love of its influence and self-conceit of its illusion. And, that's K8, it infringes upon the activity of the subject so far as inclinations are his determining grounds, and hence upon the opinion of his personal worth, which in the absence of agreement with the moral law is reduced to nothing, so that the effect of this law on feeling is merely humiliation, which we can thus discern a priori. So while self-love is natural and can be made to agree with the moral law, this is not the case with self-conceit. No mere restriction of self-conceit can bring this form of self-regard into agreement with the moral law, since it claims for a human being merely as the object of self-love the status and value that only the moral law and humanity as morally law-giving can have. So the moral law strikes down self-conceit altogether or humiliates it, showing its pretensions to be null and entirely unwarranted. This subjective negative effect of our consciousness of the moral law and our faculty of feeling obtains when we recognize that the moral law constrains our ability to take our sensible inclinations as of themselves providing sufficient reasons for action. It is the impeding of this activity of taking as that is painful. Now, the significance of Kant's use of distinctively normative language of claims, worth, pretensions, validity, and the like in this context is widely acknowledged. So, for example, Andrews Reed talks about it, Engstrom, Allison, Ware, and so on. For my purposes here, it is particularly important that the subject experiences the painful feeling affected by the moral law, right? That Kant before described merely as pain, as pain of humiliation specifically. And to experience humiliation is to be painfully aware of being downgraded, lowered in one's status of standing, to see one's claims to such a standing exposed as unwarranted. Since this feeling is essentially dependent on the comparative judgment of worth and shaped by it, it is normatively structured. Moreover, and this is a related point, the feeling of humiliation has intentionality. The moral feeling of humiliation in particular is about or directed towards something, specifically the sensible self that's kind of considered independently of morality. Perhaps better put, towards ourselves insofar as we are given to self-conceit with its claims to unconditioned worth and authority. It is a felt recognition in the face of the moral law that these claims are entirely unwarranted and null. The subject can make sense of the pain she experiences in these normative terms only in light of her awareness of the source of this feeling in her encounter with the categorical demands of the moral law. And inasmuch as she takes this feeling to be the moral law's effect on pretensions of her dear self, to morally independent self-worth. As Kant puts it, and this is K9, what in our own judgment infringes upon our self-conceit humiliates. Hence, the moral law unavoidably humiliates every human being when he compares with it the sensible propensity of his nature. So there is a kind of comparative judgment or reflection going on there. It is this judgment, this implicit comparison and recognition of the nullity of the claims of self-conceit made explicit by awareness of the authoritativeness of moral demands that constitutes what the subject feels as the feeling of humiliation specifically. Otherwise, it would be just pain of some kind, right? But it's a specific kind of pain. It's a pain of humiliation. And that requires that reflection and comparison. So it is that gives this feeling its special meaning and normative character. Recognizing demands of morality painfully disabuses us of what Kant calls the egotistical illusion that our pathologically determinable self constitutes and is legislative for our entire self. Put more simply, since at the level of ordinary practical thought, no explicit conception of the self as such is required, this recognition removes an illusion that ultimately it is our sensible nature that governs our choices, right? And our desire for happiness. But in addition, it does something else, something to which Kant does not draw the reader's attention. The subject's reflection on her felt encounter with the moral law allows her justifiably to regard her sensible nature as so constituted as also to be able to hear moral demands. That is, she can think of herself as capable of feelings that, as Kant puts it in the doctrine of virtue, accompany the constraining power of the moral law and make its efficacy felt. So hence, and this is what follows K9 on the handout, even the merely negative effect of the moral law on the mind already allows her to form a conception of herself as someone who is not so completely an animal as to be indifferent to all that reason demands on its own, as someone whose sensible nature is susceptible to being affected by moral consideration. But what about the positive effect of moral law and sensibility? So we need to talk about that in order to fully understand the role of moral feeling. Now, Kant thinks that more needs to be done to show that and how the moral law can move us to action. And I'm not really interested here in the question of motivation, but more epistemic access or epistemic role that moral feeling has in our self-understanding and self-consciousness. Nevertheless, because Kant talks about the positive aspect of the effect of moral feeling on of moral law and sensibility in the incentive chapter in a way that intertwines it with the question of motivation, we have to go into that a little bit at least. This is because the moral feeling of humiliation represents only the resistance of the moral law to incentives of sensibility and to any attempt of our pathologically determinable self to usurp the highest legislative authority. Humiliation as a merely negative attitude does not move us towards any morally grounded end or action in particular, only away from opposing sensible incentives, propensities, and self-conception. It is not on its own a moral incentive. The moral law becomes an incentive, according to Kant, when represented as the determining ground of the will, it also awakens respect for itself. Here it is important to notice a feature of Kant's treatment of respect for the moral law that is generally glossed over, namely that the feeling of moral respect is not an independent sentiment. Rather, Kant claims that the negative feeling we judge to be the pain of humiliation also has or acquires a positive meaning and an elevating character of reverence for the moral law and for its intelligible source in us, our rational self, as its legislator. But how exactly does this feeling gain the phenomenological and normative complexity it must have in order to be morality itself subjectively considered as an incentive? The complexity reflected in Kant's description of it as the reverential dread, so both positive and negative. I suggest that the same judgment that allows us to make sense, or the same reflection that allows us to make sense of the negative effect of the moral law on the mind as the pain of humiliation, also allows us to experience this very effect as a positively balanced feeling of awe or respect for the moral law. That is, our felt encounter with the moral law involves a judgment that forces us to interpret the necessary negative effect of the moral law on our sensibility is also, and at the same time, a positive feeling of respect for the moral law and to our rational nature. To be clear, I do not mean that the feeling of respect is itself a kind of judgment. Rather, I take it to be an effective awareness of the authority of the moral law that is partly a product of our making sense of what we feel when we become conscious of categorical moral demands and recognize their source in our own practical reason. In other words, it is a feeling whose meaning, complex valence, and normative character is in a way constituted by a generally implicit reflection or judgment that by painfully limiting our sensible inclinations and by rejecting the claims of self-conceit, the moral law establishes its supreme authority over the will. Consider Kant's description of the way the feeling of respect for the law is constituted, and this is K10. He says, the negative effect upon feeling, disagreeableness, is pathological, as is every influence on feeling and every feeling in general. As the effect of consciousness of the moral law and consequently in relation to an intelligible cause, namely the subject of pure practical reason as the supreme lawgiver, this feeling of a rational subject affected by inclinations is indeed called humiliation or intellectual contempt. But in relation to its positive ground, the law, it is at the same time called respect for the law. There is indeed no feeling for this law, but inasmuch as it moves resistance out of the way, in the judgment of reason, this removal of a hindrance is esteemed equivalent to a positive furthering of its causality. Because of this feeling can now also be called a feeling of respect for the moral law. So the same feeling can now also be called a feeling of respect for the moral law. While on both grounds together, it can be called a moral feeling. So first thing to notice here is that the original negative effect on feeling is something we experience in inner sense. This is why Kant describes this effect as pathological. But to call this disagreeableness the pain of humiliation is to experience painful disillusionment with one's worth as a merely pathologically determinable self, as a rational subject affected by inclinations with propensity to self-conceit, in light of one's own awareness of the supreme authority of the moral law. Notice also that to experience the negative feeling affected by the moral law as the pain of humiliation of self-conceit is to be aware of this feeling as specifically different from pains produced by ordinary sensible obstacles, say some other sensible inclination checking our present desire. For a pathologically determinable self categorized by the propensity to regard claims of self-love as highest and unconditional value cannot be humiliated simply through an encounter with more of its own inclinations. As Kant elaborates a few paragraphs later, this humiliation takes place only relatively to the purity of the law. That is, the feeling of humiliation is constituted as such by our recognition, our judgment, that the legislative activity of our pure practical reason infringes on the legislative attempts of our dear self, since, quote, what in our own judgment infringes upon our self-conceit humiliates. In other words, we can make sense of the disagreeableness we experience as humiliation of self-conceit only in light of our judgment about the authority and worth of this dear self as the source of claims of morally independent self-esteem in relation to the authority and worth of our pure rational self as the supreme lawgiver. Focusing on the other side of this relation, in reference to the positive ground of the feeling of humiliation for law, Kant now tells us that this very feeling can at the same time be called respect for the law. Notice also that it is the judgment of reason, and I quote, that does the work of esteeming the removal of the hindrance to the activity of pure practical reason to be equivalent to the positive furthering of its causality of the moral law. We necessarily judge or interpret the moral law's original negative effect on sensibility as a positive feeling of respect, as something akin to an awe before the solemn majesty of the moral law. Indeed, it is only because the judgment of reason constitutes the feeling of respect for the moral law that Kant can describe this feeling as, quote, morality itself subjectively considered as an incentive. It is not an incentive to morality, or as he stresses in the Metaphysics of Morals, not a special antecedent feeling attuned to what is good or evil, as if, like Socrates' demon, the moral feeling could precede reason or even dispense with reason's judgment. Rather, in making sense of what we feel, when we become aware of the moral law's demands, we represent morality as having a positive moving force. We consider or take or endorse what it requires of us as an incentive to action. This is why, in my view, Kant describes moral respect as a consciousness of a free submission of the will to the law, yet as combined with unavoidable constraint put on all inclinations, though only by one's own reason. Okay, now I'm moving to section 4. So far, I have argued that the feeling of respect for the moral law is constituted in part by our judgment of the moral law's supreme authoritativeness. Insofar as this consciousness is explicit, Kant tells us, moral respect can be described as the feeling of self-approbation or esteem for ourselves as moral human beings, that is, inasmuch as we cognized ourselves as determined to this effect on feeling solely by the law and without any interest, and now become conscious of an altogether different interest subjectively produced by the law, which is purely practical and free. That was K10, actually. Anyway, K11, sorry. Note, however, that this feeling is more than merely esteem for our rational nature or intelligible self. Rather, context suggests that it is a feeling of esteem for ourselves as embodied rational agents, as both intelligences, homo noumena, whose reason is law-giving, and also at the same time as sensible beings, homo phenomena, who are regarded as receptive to the law's demands. It is a feeling of esteem for ourselves as human beings who can take interest in the moral law and act from this pure moral interest, who are capable of free submission to the authority of reason's law and to moral progress. We can't put the idea this way. Respect for the moral law is indeed respect for our moral nature, but our moral nature is both rational and sensible. It involves the capacity for moral self-constraint, for being bound by the law of our own reason. We can think of ourselves as subject to the self-constraint only if we can think of our sensible nature, that our sensible nature can be constrained by moral demands, only if we can be moved by pure moral interest. This point comes through more clearly in Kant's summarizing remark on the constitution of the moral incentive, closer to the end of the incentive chapter of the second critique, and that's K12. He says, this is how the genuine moral incentive of pure practical reason is constituted. It is nothing other than the pure moral law itself, insofar as it, one, and numbering is mine, lets us discover the sublimity of our own supersensible existence, and two, subjectively affects respect for their higher vocation in human beings who are at the same time conscious of their sensible existence and of the dependence connected with it on their pathologically affected nature. The moral law is itself an incentive to action, Kant tells us, in other words, insofar as it does two things. On the one hand, our consciousness of being bound by the moral law, and that's objective determination of the will, is the basis for our awareness of our existence as free intelligences, homo noumena. On the other hand, our awareness of the solemn majesty of the moral law subjectively affects respect for our higher vocation as human beings who are conscious of their sensible nature. Now, our higher vocation, or the true vocation of reason is in us, as Kant puts it in Groundwork, is to produce the will that is good, the will that acts from pure moral interest. In discussing respect for the moral law as an incentive in Groundwork 2, Kant writes that although in thinking the concept of duty we think as objection to the law, yet at the same time we thereby represent a certain sublimity and dignity in the person who fulfills all his duties. Our moral task and a true vocation is to strive to become such a fully good-willed human being. Hence, Kant adds our own will insofar as it would act only under the condition of a possible giving of universal law through its maxims. This will, possible for us in idea, is the proper object of respect. Similarly, in the dialectic of the second critique, he identifies our moral vocation with, quote, complete conformity with the moral law and with an unending progress towards this ideal of complete or perfect virtue. But this in turn requires that we ascribe to ourselves the kind of sensibility that can be affected and shaped by practical reason over time. For aiming at perfection presupposes perfectibility. Hence, in affecting our sensibility, the moral law enables, indeed requires us to think of our sensible nature as receptive to moral requirements and as perfectible, capable of being brought into agreement with the moral law through moral action and reflection over time. In other words, our felt awareness of the moral law's effect on our faculty of feeling enables and requires us to think of our sensibility itself as shapeable by reason, as so constituted that the inclinations themselves as they arise are amenable to being ordered, trained, and disciplined by reason, as Stephen Engstrom points out, for example. I'm going to skip a little bit of the kind of more extended discussion of that point and move to sort of concluding items, since I think I'm maybe a bit over time. I apologize for that. So At the start of the essay, I raised the so-called necessitation awareness puzzle, an observation that Kant's moral feeling dependence thesis appears to clash with some of his other claims. In particular, with his insistence that moral feeling, quote, arises from consciousness of this necessitation contained in the concept of duty and is only, quote, possible through a preceding objective determination of the will and causality of reason. But we can now see that there is a non-paradoxical sense in which moral feeling both arises from our consciousness of necessitation of the will by the moral law and makes us aware of this necessitation. On the one hand, we must think of action or and as duty, as something we ought to do or strive to achieve. In Kant's terms, of the moral law as objectively determining our will, in order for us subjectively to feel its effect on our sensibility. We would not have this feeling without a representation of duty. As Kant puts it, it is a feeling which depends on the representation of a law only to its form and is inseparably connected with the representation of moral law in every finite rational being. A feeling he describes in the Metaphysics of Morals as induced most intensely in its purity by a merely rational representation. Moreover, and this is the point I want to stress, the thought of duty, our representation of the moral law as unconditional, is also a condition of our awareness of what we feel. That is, in representing something as a duty, we experience what in the critique of the power of judgment Kant calls the sensation of determinability of the will through reason itself. And we experience it as a normatively structured, complex moral feeling with both a positive and negative aspect, a complex of humiliation of the pretensions of self-love and self-conceit and of respect for the moral law, by reflectively judging or interpreting the unique sensation, sensation of determinability of the will through reason itself, its very present and phenomenological feel, in light of our representation of moral commands as categorical. In this sense, moral feeling arises from the consciousness of the necessitation contained in the concept of duty. To be clear, however, this interpretative reflective activity belongs at the level of common human practical understanding. It generally happens in the background, so to speak. It need not involve any explicit reflection on or a conception of the nature of the self or the moral constraint. So that's how the moral feeling arises from our consciousness of necessitation of the will. On the other hand, it is because this feeling is normatively structured that it can make us aware of the constraint present in the thought of duty as a normative constraint. That it can be described as the felt awareness of the constraining power of pure practical reason. Moreover, further attention to and reflection on this feeling allows us to regard ourselves as the kind of sensible beings who can be put under obligation, whose self-conceit can be humiliated by the moral law, and who are capable of freely subordinating incentives of self-love to moral demands, and not mere parts of the world of sense. Hence, it allows us to represent moral necessitation coherently as a self-constraint, a relation that requires us to regard our sensible self as the proper subject or addressee of moral requirements. To put this a bit differently, moral feeling makes possible a deeper awareness of the constraint present in the thought of duty as the self-constraint it is. Okay, some final thoughts. In rethinking Kant's hedonism, Barbara Herrmann describes our encounter with the moral law as involving the shock of self-recognition. She writes, and that's H1, we see that what we had taken to be first in the order of value, our satisfaction, is not. We are also revealed to ourselves to be persons of moral standing or dignity. Our own rational nature is a source of value that has authority over all action and choice. This confrontation with the sublimity of our nature gives rise to a strong positive feeling, a kind of self-approbation whose source is in the moral law itself. Herman goes on to argue convincingly that the feeling of respect in turn affects the whole structure of our sensible incentives. So she writes, for example, that by altering our sense of who we are, the feeling of respect changes what we count as our well-being, so that our idea of happiness comes to include the ability to exercise our moral powers and our higher vocation as its essential elements. I think this is an important point. But if my argument is correct, the feeling of respect constitutes our sense of who we are in an even deeper way. Reflection on the moral law's effect on our sensibility allows us to make sense of ourselves as bound by the moral law. It makes possible a moralized conception of ourselves as sensible beings who are nevertheless normatively constrained by the moral law as addressees or proper subjects of the categorical imperative. And it is only because the moral feeling allows us to conceive of ourselves as having receptivity to morality, to think of ourselves under the moralized conception of our sensible nature, that we can form an idea of happiness that includes our moral vocation as its essential element in the first place. Thank you. Okay, so I'll stop sharing this.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Nataliya, for this very rich talk. And we will now hand it over to Maria Borges, who will respond to your talk. Maria, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I will put my text here, but you won't see. I just read something. And I'd like to thank Professor Karen de Boer and also Nataliya Palatnik for the opportunity to discuss this essential problem in Kant's moral theory regarding moral feeling and respect. I think that the text is a very fine and rigorous account of respect and moral feeling. And also that the text focuses on a puzzle that arises from kind of double conception and importance of moral feeling and respect. I think that until the metaphysics of morals, moral feeling and respect, mainly respect, is considered a feeling that arises from our consciousness of moral law. It's mainly a consequence and not a cause of this determination. I think that Nataliya agrees with me, and then she could answer afterwards. I think that until the metaphysics of morals, I think that we agree that moral feeling, mainly respect. Respect was a consequence and not a cause of this determination of the will by the moral law. And it does not have a function in the determination of the will by moral law. I think that surprisingly, in the metaphysics of morals, as Nataliya stresses, Kant claims that. I think that is surprising because it's a kind of different, for me, it's a kind of different feeling that we have never saw in the texts. And then surprisingly, Kant claims that the consciousness of the obligation depends upon moral feeling to make us aware of the constraint present in the thought of the duty. Nataliya refers to it as moral feeling dependence thesis. And this is new, I think, and I think that she agrees with me, that it's new in the texts, in the context, that this idea that we have a kind of moral feeling dependence, and because the consciousness of the obligation, it's the capacity to receive the moral law presupposes the moral feeling. And Professor Palatnik stresses that it is in contradiction, or at least radically different from the thesis as expressed in the Critique of Practical Reason and in the groundwork, and where respect is the feeling that arises from the consciousness of this necessitation. And then it's an effect of the necessitation. And then the moral feeling dependence is the opposite. Moral feeling is the presupposition of the reception of the moral law. Then we have the puzzle here that Nataliya wants to solve. And then the puzzle here is either the moral feeling is an effect of necessitation, or there is the moral feeling, the thesis of moral feelings dependence. The effect of necessitation would be like thesis 1, moral feeling arises from the consciousness of the necessitation of the will. It is an effect of the necessitation. And the moral feeling dependence thesis, it makes us, this feeling makes us aware of the necessitation. Then it's a condition of necessitation. Then apparently it's a puzzle because both theses are contradictory. Either moral feelings arise from the consciousness of the necessitation, or we have to have moral feeling in order to accept the moral law, in order to have access to the moral law. And then this is the puzzle that Professor Palatnik wants to solve. But what is the solution of this puzzle for her? First, Nataliya refers to this kind of noumenal-phenomenal distinction, the agent as noumenal, pure rational self, is bound by the moral law, and the rational self constrains the choice of a person belonging to the order of nature, noumenal self. The addressee of the categorical imperative is this phenomenal self that is not bound by causal rules, in the sense that her actions are consequence of prior desires. Then the addressee of the categorical imperative is this phenomenal self that is not bound only by these causal rules, or it's not bound by causal rules, but by the categorical imperative. This double self is in the natural world, but has the awareness of the moral law at the same time. You know, this idea of the agent that's noumenal and also phenomenal. Nataliya understands this necessity of the moral feeling, as I understood, as something that connects this phenomenal self to the noumenal self. Is that right? My point is, why was this moral feeling absent in the prior works before Metaphysics of Morals? In this sense of something that we have to have before being affected by the moral law. My question is that that relation between a self under the law of pure practical reason and the action of the agent in the phenomenal world was already present in the groundwork and in the Critique of Practical Reason. And we didn't have this kind of moral feeling as this presupposition of the possibility of having access to the moral law. And this, I think that it's new in the Metaphysics of Morals. I think we never saw, with exception with one passage that Nataliya quoted in her texts, we never saw this moral feeling. in this other text, I think. In the passage I read again here, the Critique of Practical Reason, 575. Because of this feeling can now be called a feeling of respect for the moral law, while on both grounds it can be called a moral feeling. And both grounds here, it's end of the quotations, the end of the quotation. Both grounds here refer to the sentiment of pain associated with the discomfort of humiliation and the regard for moral law. But in general, what I think is it was the same model. I think that this model was in the groundwork, the critique of practical reason and the metaphysics of morals. We have humiliation of the self-conceit, and then we have respect. But we didn't see, my point is that we didn't see this moral feeling that is a necessary, we didn't see in this other works, like groundwork and practical reason, these other moral feelings, that it's a necessary condition to connect this phenomenal self to the moral law. Respect as moral feelings in this works is always a consequence. And then I think that we have the same schema or the same idea in the groundwork and the critique of practical reason, that the moral law humiliates the self conceit, and then it's kind of painful. And then we have this other feeling that it's respect. But in this kind of, I don't know, I say mechanics of motivation, we didn't see until the metaphysics of morals this idea that we have to, before we have to have this feeling. And this feeling, respect, was always the consequence. Then I think also that there is a difference, I don't know what Nataliya thinks about this, between moral feeling and respect for the law. I think that with some very few exceptions, and I think that we quote one in this passage that I read in the Critique of Practical Reason, until the metaphysics of morals, Kant talks mainly about respect for the law. Then what we have until the metaphysics of morals is respect for the moral law as a consequence, not the moral feeling as a presupposition, as a condition for the receptivity. I think that we don't have it, this kind of condition for the receptivity until the metaphysics of morals. You mentioned the feeling of respect as the feeling that arises as a result of the humiliation of self-conceit or self-love by the moral law. I think that you describe very well all this process in many places of your text. I think that you described in a very fine and rigorous way this process of producing the feeling of respect. As the first part is humiliation, then humiliation of your self-love or self-conceit, and then you have this kind of positive feeling towards the moral law that Kant calls respect. My point is that this feeling that is produced is not, this feeling of respect is not the same thing as the moral feeling of the metaphysics of morals. Because in the in the metaphysics of morals, I read the Metaphysics of Morals 6, 399. Moral feeling is defined as the susceptibility to feel pleasure and displeasure, merely from being aware that our actions are consistent or contrary to the law of duty. And this is what is required for the free will to be moved by pure practical reason. And Kant said also in the Metaphysics of Morals 6, 399, that no human being is entirely without moral feeling, for were he completely lacking in receptivity to it, he will be morally dead. And I think that this kind of quotations, this kind of idea that we have before we are affected by the moral law, we have this moral feeling. And I think that it doesn't apply to respect, because respect is a feeling produced by the acceptance or the consciousness of a moral law. And even if you don't have respect, you won't be morally dead, because for this idea that Kant has in the groundwork or critique of practical reason, if you don't have respect, it's okay. You'll be the moral law, you accept the moral law, you could accept the moral law because respect is only the consequence. And then Nataliya, as I understand, offers a solution for the puzzle that the moral feeling as condition of reception was already present in respect. For me, the solution is that Kant is talking about two different feelings, one that is presupposed and the other that's the consequence of moral law. When you refer to the respect to the critique of practical reason, you mention the passage where Kant claims that the feeling of respect can be seen as morality itself considered as an incentive. It's Critique of Practical Reason 576. My question is, do you think that this passage, in this passage, he's saying that respect is an incentive or the moral law is an incentive? Because I think that if you consider that it is an incentive, it is okay. It is both the incentive for moral action and the presupposition for being affected by the moral law. But if it's really only a consequence of the consciousness, I think that we still have the paradox. We still have the puzzle, something that is the consequence of being under moral law, the respect, and something that it is the cause of the possibility of being affected by the moral law. And then I think that it was very nice to read your text. I think that your text is, as I said, is very fine and rigorous about all this kind of mechanics of motivation mechanics, I would say, about respect and humiliation and all that. But I think that the puzzle is still there, because either you think of something as a consequence or a presupposition of something. And then I think that Kant says two things, but I think that he says two things of different feelings. I think that respect is one feeling, and moral feeling as a presupposition for being affected by the moral law is something else. And I think it's something else that shows up only in the metaphysics of morals. And my point is that he changed a little bit his mind, not only about that, but also about sympathy and all other feelings, I would say, that he didn't think that it was possible in the 85, 90, but then at the end, the metaphysics of morals, 97, I think that he changed a little bit his mind about that. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Maria, for these very stimulating reflections. And Nataliya, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. This is very helpful. Yeah, this moral feeling dependence thesis in this form appears, of course, first in the metaphysics of morals, when Kant discusses these concepts of what is presupposed on the part of feeling by the mind's receptivity to concept of duty. So that's right. But it's also right that in the metaphysics of morals, Kant is very interested in the capacity, in this feeling as a capacity. What kind of, again, presupposed capacities on the side of feeling we should have. But he doesn't just talk about capacity for moral feeling, he also talks about exercise, a manifestation of that moral feeling, right? So, for example, in comparing moral feeling to pathological feeling, he says the state, this is 6399, the state of feeling here is either pathological or moral. The former is that feeling which precedes the representation of the law, the latter that which can only follow upon it, right? And so that seems very much like the moral feeling that he describes in the groundwork and the critique of practical reason. So basically, what I think is that in the metaphysics of morals, he just pays more attention to the capacity itself, but he also discusses how that capacity gets realized or how it's exercised, right? So I really, so in the sense that the sense in which there is a difference between his use of moral feeling, between metaphysics of morals and earlier works, for example, or even, right, including critique of judgment, is that he is talking a little bit more here about the capacity. And he doesn't make a clear enough distinction between the capacity and its exercise. But both are there. If you can kind of read it, it's clear that both are there, it seems to me. And so when he says that no human being is without it, he is talking specifically about the capacity, right? Mm-hmm. Right, and when you are in a situation in which you have to think about your maxim, right, or you have to make a choice, that capacity actualizes, right, in an actual moral feeling. That's the way I think of it. And so I think it's continuous with the other earlier works, except that he adds this emphasis and talks a bit more about the capacity for it on the side of sensibility. And the puzzle, the way Maria, you presented it, it's as solving the puzzle. It seemed like you were thinking, maybe I misunderstood, but correct me if I did, that you have to either fall on one or the other side of it, right? It's either one or the other. And I guess what I'm saying is that we can read Kant consistently in a way that both are true, in a sense. And that doing so actually helps us better understand what kind of feeling moral feeling is and what it does. Because when we see it as structured by reflection of some kind, and I'd like to hear what people think about the kind of reflection that's there, then we can kind of say both. Yes, it is caused by, and it must be preceded by objective determination of the will, right? That you're on that part of it, on that side of it, I know, right? But we can also think of it as something that, so insofar as we think of ourselves as manifesting this capacity for moral feeling, right? As having moral feeling, we can think of ourselves as having this capacity. And if we have this capacity, that is, if our sensible nature is special in kind, that it's receptive to reasons, then we can properly think of ourselves, philosophically otherwise, as proper subject of the moral law who can be bound by it. Not merely, prudential being who has no sort of, on whom morality might not have any grip, but as someone on whom morality does have a grip. Because we have this capacity in us. And because we have this capacity in us, we can think of ourselves as proper addressee again of the categorical imperative, and as someone who can improve over time, shape their incentives and desires towards agreement with the moral law, towards virtue. So my solution to the puzzle is to say, no, we can actually read this consistently. It's not either or, it's both. We can make sense of both. And it's kind of interesting to make sense of both. It's enlightening in some way, at least it seemed to me. So that's my answer. I think I was supposed to give a short one. Probably going on a bit.
But it's very good. So it's also a
Thank you.
simulation for the questions now. And so thank you both for this very nice exchange. And now we are opening the floor for questions from the audience. So please use the raise hand function in Zoom. And if you cannot find it, just post your question on chat or raise your physical hand, and I'm sure I'll be able to see you. So the floor is officially open. Yeah, Karin.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Nataliya, and thanks, Maria, for your response. Thanks, Nataliya, for your paper. As we discussed a little bit before we started this session, we discussed your interest in intersubjectivity. And this is a dimension that is completely absent, at least from your discussion today. And repeatedly, I was asking myself, well, how is all this mechanics possible? Yes, how can we really be struck, or how can our self-love and self-deceit be struck down, such that we are capable of elevating ourselves and identifying with our pure noumenal self and so on? How is all of these mechanics possible without some concrete instance of someone who appeals to me?
Yeah.
Yes, who and
Yes.
And so if you want to
Yeah.
to think about this in terms of Levinas or in terms of Fichte, or in terms of I think our own concrete experiences, the whole procedure is, or the whole mechanics, as Maria calls it, is not going to make any sense unless there is an actual impulse
Yes.
that forces us to listen, or to put aside our own self-interest and so on. And so Kant must have been aware of this. Yeah? So why isn't he addressing this one way or another?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I don't know why he's not really addressing intersubjectivity enough in the sense of interaction with others, right? He does talk, for example, in the doctrine of right, about making contracts, right, and relations and so on. And maybe that can be kind of a little bit of a model for how kind of moral interactions can happen, or how morality enters into any kind of interaction between human beings. But I completely agree with you, because Kant says we have this moral feeling anytime we sort of draw up maxims for ourselves, right? When we have to decide what to do, that's when we have moral feeling, and that's when we can recognize our own freedom. But what's interesting is the cases that he uses, or the primary cases for when this happens, are things like the gallows man example, right?
So which example?
Gallows man. It's an example in the Critique of Practical Reason where it's supposed to illustrate the fact of reason, right? So suppose that you have a lustful inclination, and there is this person in another village that you want to visit, but you know that if you go there, they'll catch you and hang you, right? That lustful inclination sort of immediately kind of dampens or something like that, right? But if you are asked to falsely testify against an innocent person, you at least feel the pull of the moral law, right? You have this, so supposedly you have moral feeling, right? And you recognize that this is something you ought not to do, and you have the moral feeling, and you can even recognize your freedom from it. Anyway, so that's sometimes referred to as the gallows man example. But in examples like that, or examples of trying to kind of falsely get a deposit or something like that, right? Like, let's say, lying on a loan application. It always involves somebody else, what I'm trying to say. it's always with someone. It's always a duty towards another that operates in these examples, or in most of them. Sometimes they're not all like that. But it seems like, and I sort of argue this in this other paper about freedom at distance, that it really to recognize our own freedom and to be and we can now add, to have this moral feeling, you need another to call on you or something. You need an impulse. So that's a bit of a connection there. Kant himself doesn't quite make it. He doesn't make that connection. I also think that to recognize another as a person, it's not enough. So I've argued that you need to be able to exchange reasons and with them, right? How do you recognize? How do I know, Karen, that you are a human person, right? We talk and we exchange reasons, right? And qua moral persons, maybe we'll talk about something that both of us care about, right? And I recognize you as a giver and a taker of reasons or something like that. But that seems like it's not enough. I have also to see you as a moral person. I have to see you as the kind of being that has this kind of special sensibility, this capacity for moral feeling. And what I want to figure out is what allows me to do that. So even if we talk about Kant's maxims of kind of rational thought that he talks about in the Yasha logic and in the critique of judgment, think for yourself, think in the place of the other, think consistently, right? How is that possible? That allows putting ourselves in a position of the other, right? Mm-hmm. Position of the other person. And recognizing, again, thinking of reasons from their point of view, from what concerns them and what matters to them. And it seems like sensibility has to be an important part of it. We can't just talk about exchange of reason without thinking about the emotional or affective attitudes that perhaps allow us to recognize something as a reason or shape what a reason is to begin with. Anyway, that's probably also a bit long-winded, but those are the connections.
Thank you very much.
Good. Further questions? Yes, David.
So,
you're muted.
Hear me?
Okay. Yes.
Yes,
so
we can hear you.
Thank you very much for the talk and the answer. Is more, my question is it's maybe unfair, so it's more about the historical context and the relationship between Kant's ethics and Baumgarten's ethics. I don't know. This kind of ambiguity that I think is in the center of the discussion about, for example, if respect is something that's a condition or the consequence. And yeah, so this kind of ambiguity, I think I find myself in this kind of discussion by reading Baumgarten's ethics, because there is a distinction in Baumgarten that Kant took this distinction from Baumgarten between incentives, or how do you say, so what moves us, their representations. And in Baumgarten, it's not clear what is the difference between what moves us, for example, to acting rational, and the representation of what Baumgarten calls volition, so a rational representation that we desire. So it's something that it moves to desire, and that is the representation of what desire. This is an ambiguity. There is an ambiguity in Baumgarten, and I think maybe it's the same ambiguity that we are dealing with Kant. But I don't know. It's just
no, that's interesting. Yeah,
for
it
Nataliya
could
and for
be.
Maria too, if who wants to answer.
Yeah,
Thank you
and
very
of
much.
course, yeah. No, that's very interesting. And Kant also thinks, I think, that our consciousness of necessitation, it has a kind, I think, has a there is a representation, objective representation aspect of it, and that comes with feeling. So I've been kind of separating them analytically, so to speak, but it's they're probably not sort of separable in fact. So when we represent something as a duty, we represent it feelingly or something like that, right? There is an affective or subjective side to it. And so Kant often talks like that, because the determination of as sensibly affected power of choice always feels in a certain way, right? So so I think there is that there, and I think that inseparability shows up more in the critique of judgment than a few places. So right, both in the first introduction and in the critique of judgment a bit later. I think it's 222, somewhere there. But that's an interesting.
David, do you have a follow-up, or I see that you want to say something?
Yeah, man. And I it's very unfair to ask that. So, but I mean, it's a great opportunity to discuss all these things. Do you think that maybe that's something that we can find in other authors than Kant? For example, in pre-Kantian authors like Wolff, Baumgarten, these two sides of the same thing, but objective and subjective. Maybe so can.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, it would make sense that something like this is in Baumgarten because Kant used his books, right, for lecturing. Yeah. But he might have picked up some something like that. But unfortunately, I'm not familiar myself with that part of Baumgarten's work. So, yeah, if you have a reference, I'd love to see the reference for that.
So I will write you. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yeah, sure, of course. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay,
yeah.
I'd like to comment a little bit, but I think my bet is that in the groundwork and the critical reason that Kant really wants to not to use this kind of moral feeling. And then it was only respect. But then at the metaphysics of morals, he has to say something about the psychological features of human being, and then he changed his mind about not only, but it's the my position is different from Nataliya's position, but I think that not only about moral feeling, but also about sympathy. I think that when he was more like the critical philosopher, he really denies this idea of that you have moral feeling and then you have to use your sympathy, but then the metaphysics of moral, something changed. That's my position.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, and Karin just posted on the chat a reference. Do you want to say something about this, Karin?
Yeah, so that's my friend Toshiro Osawa, who published this book recently.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Thank you very much.
Good. Kakula, please, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much. It was a beautiful talk, and thank you for the response by Maria Borges. Maybe I also have an unfair question. I want to learn what you think about the potential place of the notion of moral feeling in Kant's legal philosophy. So what I'm thinking about is the following. So one can say, for example, so thinking about the place of the notion of moral feeling in Kant's philosophy of law, one can say, for example, that the universal principle of right and all our juridical duties, they are basically based on the categorical imperative. And given that the categorical imperative produces this kind of moral feeling in us, our juridical duties and the universal principle of right, they also produces a kind of moral feeling in us when we think about them, or when we think that we have a juridical obligation. But that interpretation seems to clash with Kant's idea that when we talk about our juridical duties, external performance of our duties simply suffice. So we don't need to be motivated by any respect for the moral law, any kind of recognition that that our duties must be fulfilled for their own sake or for the sake of morality. So these are the kind of just thoughts that I thought of when you were talking about the moral feeling. So I wonder what you think about. I wonder whether there is any place for the notion of moral feeling in Kant's juridical philosophy. So this is my question. So thank you very much in advance.
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. I haven't thought about that precisely for the reason that you kind of mentioned in your comment, that it just kind of doesn't sit with the fact that you don't need a moral feeling, right? You should just obey the law. So its legal validity is really not, a legal obligation is not based on moral obligation or something like that. Plus, there are complications here, right? Because there is a kind of a dispute about whether the doctrine of right is really, or in what way is the doctrine of right based on the moral law, the categorical imperative, right? Or whether they are kind of just supposed to be complementary or something. So, but supposing that it is based in the categorical imperative as in some way or another, which seems right to me. And again, I'd have to think more about this because it's a kind of a really interesting question. But you could say that insofar as you're a moral being and you recognize that this is a duty, right? Perhaps you would have a moral feeling, and but it's sort of from the legal standpoint, it doesn't matter whether you do or not. But perhaps the moral feeling that you do have can be cultivated, and that could be a ground for kind of political fraternity and ground for kind of relations to others as part of the political community, as persons in the first place, and as kind of a binding or part of that fraternity or bindingness in the community. I don't know. It's really kind of fascinating thing to think about, actually, what it might be. But also, duties of right can also be duties of virtue, right? And so, when we connect those two, then moral feeling does come in when you actually see it as your moral obligation to fulfill legal duties. Even though you have to fulfill them whether or not you think that. But that's really interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good. Further questions or comments, remarks? Maria, if there is anything that remained somehow unaddressed, or you'd like to press a little bit more or ask, feel free. No? Okay.
No, it's okay for me. It's okay.
Maria, if you wouldn't mind sending me your comments, I'd love to actually.
Okay, I'd like. Okay,
thank you.
Okay, I can send you. Okay.
Really
Thank you. It was very interesting, the discussion. I think that's this moral feeling, respect is still something that we have as Kant scholars or Kantians or something, philosophers, that we still have to work on it. I think it's important.
Good. Manu?
Yes, if there is still time, Luis, I don't know if otherwise.
Go ahead. We have
Yes.
time. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Natalia, and well, both of you, Natalia and Maria, for this interesting discussion. Also to contribute with this series of unfair questions, because it's slightly beyond the scope of your paper, but I was interested in how this reflects in Kant's work on religion. Because it seems to me that this is precisely the problem of the moral part on the text on religion, right? That how is that religion can provide a certain education for this moral disposition of subjects, right? I don't know if you think that there is a role there also because of this self-humiliation you talked about is somehow related to the idea of this supreme legislator that comes in with the religious consciousness. So just I was wondering what are your thoughts on this?
So specifically how this relates to, can you say just a little bit more how it relates to religious education specifically, or moral education?
Because it seems that the question is to what extent you were saying that moral feelings are somehow indispensable to have a real moral consciousness, right? And to really ensure this moral commitment. And I think that religion, for Kant, this pure religion plays a similar role in the sense that we need to conceive these moral commandments as emanating from God, or even the archetype of this perfect person that is the Christ plays a role in showing us that we can be moral, and that there seems to be sensible elements at play here, right? That's why I was wondering that maybe.
Okay, so so when I'll start it a little bit earlier. So when Kant talks about predispositions to the good, right? One of them is predisposition to personality, right? And that's to be, and he explicitly describes it as a predisposition, as a moral feeling, as having this capacity, right? So to be a person, you have to have that feeling. It's almost, it's part of what it means to be a person. Now, as we we of course have these moral archetypes of virtue, right? Setting God aside, because that's not really our archetype. Our archetype is something like the Son of God, right? Like Jesus or somebody like that. A Stoic sage, he sometimes mentions in other works. So this perfectly moral being, where do we place this this moral being? So supposedly, this being is still human, right? And in being human, insofar as being human, that being will still have this moral feeling. So the moral feeling is not going to go away, right? And supposedly both its painfulness and its positive feel of respect for the moral law will remain, as long as we have, as this archetype, a human being. In relation to what it does to sort of help us move towards or strive towards that archetype, right? The moral feeling, Kant talks about, of course, different kind of modes of that feeling in the metaphysics of morals, like conscience, love of human beings, respect, and so on. He talks about being a need for cultivation of that, right? And for putting yourself in the situations where you can experience it more and maybe more acutely, and it will somehow help you recognize maybe morally salient situations, and at the same time be perhaps ultimately be more moved to act as you should. I don't know. There's probably a lot more can be said about its role in kind of helping to shape our sensibility as such.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you so much for this very nice and stimulating session. And please join me in thanking our speaker and respondent for a very nice session.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was wonderful. I really appreciate it.
That's really nice.
Yeah, and I've learned a lot from both comments and questions. And yeah, and it's such a lovely group of people. So
that's really nice. I just want to mention that it was the final session of the fall program, and that the spring program of 2026 will be posted soon online. And you are all very welcome to join sessions of the spring program and of the fall program 2026 moving forward.
Great.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, and please remain connected if you want to have some informal conversations. And
yes.
Okay.
Thank you.